He's Michael Beller, executive producer of the Athletics Football Show. Michael, thanks for joining the chat. How are we doing today?
I am doing well. Thanks for having me, guys. Excited for week 2.
Yeah, we're excited to get into this. Week 1 in fantasy, I mean, it was, as we always like and as you always expect, excitement, a lot of volatility, and a lot of surprises. But let's looking into week 2 now. Who are guys that you are eyeing with their matchups, whether it's Thursday night or all the way to Monday night, that have good matchups that you say are must starts? And of course, outside of the guys that are the studs that you got in the early rounds of your draft.
Yeah, of course. You know what? I'll try to ease some panic. Let's start at the quarterback position. I'm still starting Joe Burrow with plenty of confidence. I don't care how he's picking up water bottles. I don't care about the flexing of the wrist. I care a little bit more about Jamar Chase not being there all summer and T. Higgins looking like he's maybe not going to play again in week 2. But I'm not really concerned about Joe Burrow either this week or in the long term. And then you couple it with what you said, the studs you take early in your draft. Chances are if you have Joe Burrow, you're not going to have another quarterback right there ready to start ahead of him. So I totally feel fine starting him. I'm not going and reaching and grabbing anyone off the waiver wire to start over Joe Burrow. Things are going to be fine in Cincinnati. Things are going to be fine with Burrow. Starting him with plenty of confidence. I like Gus Edwards also this week. The numbers obviously favored J.K. Dobbins a week ago, but Gus still got 11 carries in that game. We know what Jim Harbaugh wants to do. We know what the Chargers want to do. Big favorites here this week. They're going to run the ball plenty. I'll follow the opportunity and go with Gus Edwards, even though we have to acknowledge if one guy in that backfield is ahead right now, it's J.K. Dobbins. Those are two guys who I'm looking at who maybe people were a little concerned of with what they did in week 1, who I still feel plenty of confidence, rolling with here in week 2.
Yeah, I like that Gus Edwards pick because, like you said, the shares were there and the touches were there for both of them. But as you saw Gus Edwards last season with the Ravens, I mean, just a touchdown vulture, a guy that could break big runs. And with as good as this offensive line is in LA, a guy like Gus Edwards is someone you want to roll with. What about guys you're eyeing that you say, you know what? I understand why you'd want to start them, but because of a matchup or because of a situation, I'm going to sit them in week 2.
Yeah, let's stick at the running back position here. Jerome Ford for the Cleveland Browns, another guy who's going to get plenty of work. But there's just a whole lot of things outside of what that offense can be that makes me just want to stay away from them entirely. I just don't have a lot of confidence in what they're going to be able to do offensively this week or really for a bit down the road here. I think there's just a lot going on with that offense that makes this a bad environment regardless of the player involved. Now, let's say we're talking about a healthy Nick Chubb. He can transcend what a situation is. Jerome Ford has some charms. He is not an A-plus Nick Chubb. And so I just don't think he is able to transcend what that Cleveland offense is right now. He is someone who I'm staying away from. Another guy who you probably took with an eye on him being a regular starter for you, who I'd be wary of here in week 2, it's Calvin Ridley. We got to see a little bit more from Will Levis before we can trust Calvin Ridley as a week in, week out starter. If you went a little cheap at wide receiver, maybe he's still one of your 2-3 best options on your team. I think most Calvin Ridley fantasy managers are going to have people they can turn to who are just in better situations than he is with Will Levis. It might hurt to sit him down in week 2, but I think we got to see a little bit more from Levis than what we saw against Chicago last week before we can trust maybe anyone in that passing game.
You break my heart with that Jerome Ford call as an owner of him. But, I mean, without their top 2 tackles, we don't know when they'll be back. The quarterback situation is absolutely terrible. And that's a really good defensive line in Jacksonville with 3 good defensive linemen, including Armstead in the middle. Michael, I understand that Jerome Ford staying away there. So, speaking of a running back in this context, I think a lot of people had that scare, that last-minute scare of Christian McCaffrey goes down, especially for the guys that picked him first overall. And if they didn't draft Jordan Mason or scoop him up right away, they're probably without a paddle right now. So what are other running back options out there that those CMC owners can get, or in this case, a Jerome Ford owner can pick up just to help weather the storm? And I'm not talking about myself, but I am, Michael. I am a little bit.
Hey, look, I've been doing this for a long time. I've been wrong plenty of times. I could be wrong again right away this week about Jerome Ford. It scares me a little bit with what's going on in Cleveland.
Yeah.
Someone who I tried to get in my leagues this week, and I unfortunately whiffed on him in both leagues where I was chasing him, was Tank Bigsby. I think you look at what Jacksonville wants to do on offense this year, and you see both he and ETN getting plenty of work in that game against Miami. Script probably had something to do with it. They got up early in that game. They were nursing a multiple score lead for a big chunk of that game. So maybe that has something to do with Tank Bigsby getting the 12 carries that he got in it. But you go back over Travis Etienne's career and you see a guy who has some explosiveness, but doesn't give you every single thing you want out of a running back. We know that they're both going to be involved. And when you get to this stage of the running back position, you know you're going to have to live with his teammates eating up some of what the backfield share is. So that's going to be true for all of these guys. Tank Bigsby, I think, has enough of a role in Jacksonville's offense and is a guy who a lot of fantasy people were very excited about a year ago. It's hard for any rookie to get acclimated to the league. So now he has that second full training camp under his belt, a role that I think Jacksonville wants to be able to bank on. Maybe doesn't always quite reach 12 carries, but I think we're looking at 8, 12, 14 opportunities for him week in and week out. And at the running back position, with the state of what it is nowadays, I think that's something that you can lean on more often than not.
Yeah, you just want at least a high floor and someone that has that touchdown opportunity. The offense is good, but I agree with you. Watching Tank Bigsby run in week 1, I mean, that guy's downhill, that's fast, but not afraid to break runs outside and was getting some clutch touches. Staying with the running backs one more time, you speak about, you mentioned Gus Edwards, you mentioned Tank Bigsby, so those are split carries. But in a backfield of a quarterback you mentioned, in Tennessee, between Tyjae Spears and Tony Pollard. Pollard broke that big run against the Bears, looked good. Is that a backfield you would approach with patience, or is that something that you've seen and go, you know what, I think Pollard is that one, and I would start him? Or is that something you would stash away maybe on the bench if you don't need him to start for you?
I would want to lean in that direction, but to be honest with you, that's got a whole lot more to do with Will Levis than it has to do with Tony Pollard versus Tyjae Spears. We've seen it from Pollard, and we've seen it from Pollard in a role where he was being a complementary or at least a backfield sharing back. And so that gives me some confidence in him. We're not talking about a guy with a ton of tread on the tires. We're not talking about a guy who's getting up there into an age bracket where we start to get concerned about this position. So I feel better about him. If we're talking about him versus Spears, I would still want to find a way to get away from Tennessee's offense. Mm-hmm. But if I'm sitting here, I'm looking at Tony Pollard as one of my top 3 backs. I feel okay about it. I think we go into every week assuming he is a top 25, top 28 option at the position, and then we let things shake out from there.
I love that standout, and it makes sense too. Like this bad quarterback play, more in the box, worse opportunities or less opportunities, I should say, to even just score a touchdown because Will Levis, I mean, that pick 6 was one of the worst pick 6s I've ever seen in my life. And Will Levis knew it, got down to his knees, hand on his head, like, what have I done? So speaking of quarterbacks then, and I'm not going to talk about Will Levis here, but for those Jordan Love owners, maybe those owners out there that were dependent on Kirk Cousins and saying, I like him in this system, I like him with these weapons, and then they see him looking like a statue, they can't push off his right foot. Who are quarterbacks out there that they should target to pick up, or if they have someone on their bench of, hey, these are guys I would definitely start?
Yeah, first of all, I wouldn't just necessarily be getting away from Kirk Cousins quite yet. Obviously, it's not what you want to see from him. There might be a little bit of growing pains here for him to get back to health, but I think when he is fully back, we're going to see what we thought we would get out of him for the bulk of the season. As for this week specifically, I still look at guys who are in situations who I think are going to be on the winning side of games when we get to this. And so a couple of guys who might be available who fit that, Justin Fields at the top of that list. I just think that that's going to be a situation where because of what Pittsburgh is able to do defensively, the offense is going to have opportunities. I think Bo Nix is going to have a very, very tough time with that Pittsburgh defense. So he's someone who, if you need a short-term boost for Kirk Cousins, for Jordan Love being out, I would look at him. If they win that game, gotta think Justin Fields holds on to that starting job, and I do think they go into Denver and win that game. Tough spot this week for Derek Carr going up against Dallas, but you gotta love what you saw out of this offense in week 1. It was Carolina. All the caveats that apply there certainly do apply, but Clint Kubiak was doing all sorts of wacky stuff with that offense. You had Alvin Kamara lined up out wide. You had Taysom Hill doing Taysom Hill things. You had Juwan Johnson sometimes in line, sometimes out. Rashid Shaheed lined up in the backfield. They scored 47 points, and Chris Olave has 2 catches for 11 yards. Like, there's a lot of cool stuff happening in that week 1 game for New Orleans. Don't necessarily love him this week against Dallas. If you're in a tough spot because you all only had Jordan Love and no one else, I would feel okay with it. But I think Derek Carr could be someone who we look at as a totally fine week in and week out starter who has some spike weeks, like we saw in week 1.
Yeah, I love that point out. And, you could hate Derek Carr, the quarterback, but Derek Carr, the fantasy quarterback, he can throw it deep. He loves to sling it. And with the Rashid Shaheed and Chris Olave on the outside, that's something you want. Looking across the entire league and all the games we have, who do you think will be the MVP of the week? And if you're not certain on, I know I'm kind of backing you a corner with that particular of a question.
It's what we do.
Who's a guy you're watching like, man, I love what he can do this week against that defense?
All right, so I'm not exactly going to be splitting the atom here, but I just think Cooper Kupp has a monster week. We saw last week what the Rams' offense was still able to
Mhm.
do without Puka Nacua and without a ton of their offensive line out there. Maybe that says something about what Detroit did in the offseason, even though we thought they made all these improvements, especially in the secondary. We'll see how Aaron Glenn's defense comes together over the next couple of weeks here. But Cooper Kupp's just going to get a ton of targets. And I think that's going to end up being one of the more fun games on the slate. Rams, Cardinals, I expect a fair amount of points in that one. And I just don't see a realistic way, unless I'm totally wrong about how back and forth the scoring is, that Cooper Kupp doesn't get 14, 15 targets in this game. It's a tall order to ask of any receiver. It seems like such a layup of a number when you are as good as him and when you are so clearly the only show in town the way he is with Puka Nacua out. But if this game does go back and forth, it just feels like we're going to get back to the Cooper Kupp of a couple of years ago, the Cooper Kupp-Matthew Stafford relationship of a couple of years ago, where the guy rolled out of bed and got 10, 11 targets, let alone what we would see in a high-scoring game. So I just think we're going to be looking at something similar to last week, where he gets 15 targets, catches 12 of them for 150 and a touchdown. I think you're going to be very happy with Cooper Kupp this week.
It is fun watching him get back to that 2021 Cooper Kupp. In that same breath of that Rams receiving group, Demarcus Robinson, Tyler Johnson, those were the popular names to pick up once Nacua was put on the IR. Out of those two guys, is that something wait and see, or do you see someone having a better role than the other? Well, they both had 7 targets in that Sunday night game.
Yeah, wait and see kind of kills you in fantasy. By the time you have seen, it's too late. So I don't think you can do that. I'll plant my flag on Demarcus Robinson just because we've seen what he can do with Sean McVay. We've seen what he can do in some explosive offenses. I don't think, though, that either one of them is going to rise to a level where you want to be starting them regularly unless you are in a situation where injuries, by the time the bye weeks really get here, Nacua probably back off IR, especially with the Rams having a week 6 bye, one of the earlier bye weeks in the league. It just doesn't feel like a situation where either one of them is going to rise to a level of surefire fantasy starter. Good real-life players, important real-life players for the Rams while Nacua is out. In our fantasy game, probably guys who you have just stashed on your bench in case something goes wrong with one of your regular starters.